Put
All
on my
right.
serious face.
So I have a little case of sinusitis, so forgive me if I drink tea to try to keep my voice rolling. But we are about to start, excuse me, lecture number 71, which Billy and I figured out is now exactly 2 years. The first thing was January 6th,
Oh my gosh, yeah.
2022. It is now January 3rd of 2024, which means we've been learning together for 2 years on the mark. And today we're about to do chapter 24 of book 2, which would be exactly, when we finish it, will be exactly halfway through book 2. And there's 3 books, which means we're basically at the halfway mark of the entire guide for the Perplexed. So now, I want to make a little introduction here, and we mentioned it a couple times, and that was the idea of what is nowadays called the God of the Gaps theory, right? And it's an argument which religious theologians occasionally posit when science hits a dead end, right? And they try to use it to prove and say, look, science explains all this and this, but this doesn't make sense. Must be God, right? Now, uh, many scientists and philosophers have pointed out that this idea of God of the gaps is a very dangerous idea, because all you need to do is wait another few years, and some new scientist is going to figure out the answer to whatever that puzzle was. And that's how, if you look back at science, whenever science hits a point where things don't make sense, eventually somebody figures it out and science advances. So the reason why I'm bringing this up is because throughout the chapter that we're about to read, you're going to think that the Rambam is about to make a God of the gaps argument. And there were a few times when he kind of made this argument already. And that was the idea that Aristotle's physics explains everything under the cycle of the moon. In other words, that's the Rambam's way of saying everything in the universe within which we live, because the lowest cycle, the lowest sphere is the moon. But everything above it doesn't follow all the rules, and therefore Rambam said it must be. If you explain that God created it, then it makes sense. And that sounds awfully like a God of the gaps idea, which is a philosophically and logically flawed and historically very dangerous um, ground to stand on. So I'm just warning you that it's going to sound like a God of the gaps argument as we read through chapter 24, but then Rambam is going to throw a zinger in at the end, which will change all of that. So I'm kind of giving you a little bit of of a of a preview. So here we go. Now, chapter 24, I will admit up front that my personal knowledge of astronomy is not the greatest. Certainly, um, no one really wasted that much time teaching me Ptolemaic astronomy, which at the time of the Rambam, Ptolemy's version of astronomy was the only one that was the best explanation for the movements of the planets and the stars that they had, but there was a lot of difficulty with it. And the Rambam is going to point out a lot of these things, how Ptolemy's doesn't make sense. Now, as we know historically, because we have really nice hindsight glasses on, right? We know of all of these pressures and tensions that Rambam is going to bring about, which demonstrate the complete inadequacy of Ptolemaic astronomy, built up and built up for another few hundred years until Copernicus, and Galileo finally figured it out that the whole thing was off, right? And then some of the physics problems, which the Rambam didn't could not work within the upper spheres, will be what leads to Newton's discoveries of things like gravity, inertia, the concept of a vacuum. These are things that became uh, important later. So all of the pressure that Rambam is mentioning now, it's interesting to read it from a historical perspective. A guy who is extremely well versed in the science of his day, what does he feel like when it all doesn't make sense, right? We read about it in the history books. We read from hindsight. We talk a lot about the guys that solved the problems, but we don't talk about all of these tremendous minds that just were racking their brains as to what's going on. Like, it just doesn't make sense. So we're about to read a couple pages of this, and it's a lot of it. I'll admit I don't fully understand, but I don't spend that much time working on figuring out problems that don't exist anymore, that are based on physics that has been debunked hundreds of years ago. So, but here we go. Of astronomical matters. I'm in chapter 24, page 322. Astronomical matters, what you have read under my guidance and understood from the contents of the Almagest. Now, when Rambam says you here, just remember that he's talking to his student to whom he wrote this book. If you remember way back in the beginning, the Almagest, and that, forgive me if I'm butchering the pronunciation, but that's Ptolemy's famous book in which he writes of his understanding. What Ptolemy basically did was it was obvious that these rotating spheres of Aristotle just don't work, because some stars go this way, go that way, some of them go within different orbits, and it just doesn't work. So Ptolemy worked out this whole complex system of epicycles, where there are some cycles within cycles, like some spheres within spheres that rotate within the spheres, and that's how so every planet that he documented, he tried to figure out that planet's way of going around, and he said, oh, that planet's going around within this one, and this one's going around within that one, and then so he was trying to come up with something that matched reality, because Aristotle's idea of spheres simply didn't match reality. The naked eye, without a telescope, by Rambam's time, everyone was clearly able to see that Aristotle's idea of this very simplistic idea of one sphere and another sphere, and each one is a perfectly round sphere going round and round, simply doesn't work with reality. So Ptolemy desperately tried to rescue the idea of the spheres and make little epicycles within the spheres, and spheres within spheres, and spheres that move in different places within spheres, all that kind of stuff, and certain spheres that don't actually revolve around the center, because some of them are eccentric, some of them go around in like oval shape, right? And they were able to measure this back then. So all of these were holes that were being slammed into the Aristotelian view of the universe. So the Rambam is going to be bringing up a bunch of these holes. So he's basically saying, you, my student, Yosef, right? That was the name of his student. I'm not referring to a member of our lecture right now, right? You know of astronomical matters, you've read under, I taught you, and I gave you Ptolemy's book, Almagest, to read, so you should be up to date on the latest astronomical textbooks. But there was not enough time to begin another speculative study with you, right? And that is what I'm going to tell you now. What you know already is that as far as the action of ordering the motions and making the course of the stars conform to what is seen is concerned, right? When we're trying to make the motions and movements of the stars conform to what is seen, and what we imagine in our brain to make sense, it would all be beautiful if everything went round and round in perfect circles and perfect spheres. But it's not what we see. So either that of the epicycles or that of the eccentric spheres, or on both of them. Now I shall draw your attention to the fact that both of these principles are entirely outside the bounds of reasoning. In other words, when we try to use those two ideas, eccentricity, meaning circles that don't revolve around an exact center, right? And epicycles, meaning spheres that rotate within spheres, doesn't make sense according to Aristotelian physics, right? It might be a nice explanation for why the stars move the way they do, but in the first place, if one affirms as true the existence of an epicycle revolving around a certain sphere, if it's true that one epicycle, that's a cycle within a cycle, revolves with, positing at the same time that revolution is not around the center of the sphere carrying the epicycles, so you have this big sphere going around within the middle, and then there's another sphere like rotating within that sphere as that sphere goes around. So it follows necessarily that there is rolling, right? So that the epicycle rolls. In other words, it used to be here, and now as that sphere goes around, now it's there, and as it keeps rolling around, now it's up there, and so on. So this is impossible. This is the impossibility that was to be avoided, namely the assumption that there should be something in the heavens that changes its place. The point Aristotle had, it didn't make sense to Aristotle that something should be in a different place within the sphere. It doesn't work. For this reason, he quotes Abu Bakr ibn I don't know how to pronounce that, but he states in his extent discourse on astronomy that the existence of epicycles is impossible. So Ptolemy tried to solve the problem with Aristotelian physics by using epicycles, and this philosopher said, well, but epicycles doesn't make sense according to Aristotelian physics, right? In addition to this impossibility, necessarily following from the assumption of the existence of epicycles, he sets forth there are other impossibilities that also follow from that assumption. I'll explain them to you now. So the bottom line is, he said, is that the Aristotle's explanation is completely contradicted by what we see in the heavens. That's the bottom line. It just doesn't make any sense. It doesn't work. The revolution of the epicycles is not around the center of the world, right? These epicycles, they're revolving within those spheres, right? They're not revolving around the center of the world, right? It's a fundamental principle in this world. This is an Aristotelian fundamental principle, okay? That there are three motions: a motion from the midpoint of the world, in other words, something going up, which is, remember, Rambam, they clearly understood the world was round. So going up, meaning away from the middle, right? Something going down toward that point, nothing going toward the middle, which is like a rock falling down, and a motion around, which is a circular motion, which goes around and around that middle, right? But if an epicycle existed, then its motion would be neither from that point nor toward it nor around it. It's going round and round and round in the middle of the sky, going around something else. Furthermore, it is one of the, so that basic fundamental assumption of Aristotelian physics just fell apart when you looked at the heavens, right? Furthermore, it is one of the most, if any one of you ever teaches elementary school and teaches the incredible achievements of Copernicus and Galileo, right? Keep this in mind, because this can give you an idea, this chapter, of just how incredibly confusing, right, astronomy was before they figured out that all this business with the spheres is all just totally bunch of baloney, right? And that the world is not the middle of anything. And if anything, we were revolving around the sun, but even that's not, it's so on and so forth. It's, so just remember this chapter if you ever have to teach it to someone. Hence, it is necessary that the earth should be immobile, right? If everything goes around the earth has to be standing in a spot. If epicycles exist, there would be a circular motion that doesn't revolve around the immobile thing. And everyone knows that the earth is immobile, right? Sure. So I have heard that Abu Bakr has stated that he invented an astronomical system in which no epicycles figured, only eccentric circles. So he came up with better than Ptolemy. I'm not going to do these epicycles, which are circles within circles. I'm going to do eccentric circles. Although they're not really circles. They're just circles that don't really go around any given point. So he figured out a way to do it. However, I have not heard of this from his pupils. In other words, nobody ever explained to me exactly how he makes this happen. But somebody out there, the rumor is that he had figured out a way. But even if this were truly accomplished, he wouldn't have gained that much. For eccentricity also necessitates going outside the limit. That also contradicts Aristotle, right? Those principles to which nothing can be added. So it was by me that attention was drawn to this point. I was the one who showed that the students of Abu Bakr, right, that even if you eliminated the epicycle problem, you can't have an eccentric circle. So in the case of eccentricity, we likewise find that the circular motion of the spheres doesn't take place around the midmost point, but around an imaginary point that is other than the center of the world. Accordingly, that motion is likewise not a motion taking place around an immobile thing. If, however, someone having no knowledge of astronomy thinks that eccentricity with respect to these imaginary points may be considered, right? So when these points are situated inside the sphere of the moon, as they appear to be at the outset, as equivalent to motion around the midmost point of the world, we would agree to concede this to him. I'll explain this in a minute. If that motion took place around a point in the zone of fire or of air, right? So if you're going to tell me, right, that the eccentricity is something that's possible as long as the points that it's rotating around are within the universe that we see, which is the world underneath the moon. In other words, the world that part of the universe that we live in. It could make sense if it's moving around up in the skies, right? Though in that case, like where fire and air is, right? Those are the different layers under the moon, right? The four things, the fire being the highest and so on. In that case, motion would not be around an immobile thing. We will, however, make it clear to him that the measures of eccentricity have been demonstrated in the Almagest according to what is assumed there. And the latter-day scientists have given a correct demonstration. I just turned the page to 324, regarding which there is no doubt of how great the measure of these eccentricities is compared with half the diameter of the Earth. It has consequently become clear, I skipped a sentence, that the eccentric point around which the sun revolves must of necessity be outside the concavity of the sphere of the moon. So the bottom line is, I've explained this, and you can read through the rest, and he goes through the sphere of Mercury, the sphere of Venus, the sphere of Saturn, Mars, Jupiter, The bottom line is that if you draw all of these eccentric circles that are rotating around something else, right? They're all supposed to be rotating around the Earth as the center, but they're not. Because if you draw that circle and you make the sun go in one of these eccentric things, then the circle around which the sun is rotating isn't the center of the Earth if you measure it all out. In other words, mathematically, they had proven that these eccentric circles don't make sense because everything seems to be rotating around some other point. Okay? So I'm going to skip till the end of this paragraph just to make that point. These are the difficulties that scientists then were trying to work their way through. Rambam is going to mention in a minute that Aristotle didn't have the advanced mathematics that they already had in the Rambam's time. Right? By the time the Rambam is writing, mathematics had already advanced significantly into early calculus and algebra, and I'm not a mathematician, so other people might know a lot more about this than me. But by this time, they're already able to calculate, based on the distances that things they saw travel in the sky and how they compared to other distances, where all the centers would be. And none of it worked out according to Aristotelian physics, right? Even more incongruous and dubious is the fact, and I'm at the second thing, is that in all cases, and here I'm going to skip a little too, but I just want to point out, Rambam puts out a demonstrated fact that vacuums don't exist, which is an Aristotelian idea and a Platonic idea, and Greek philosophers up to the time of Rambam and his neo-Aristotelian world that he lived in, that an actual vacuum is a concept they couldn't conceive of. It wasn't until hundreds of years later when we understood the concept of a vacuum and how important that is, right? But that space is actually a vacuum. Now, if there's no such thing as a vacuum, the bottom line is that everything is therefore touching and is congruent with the next one. So as every sphere moves, of necessity, the sphere below it also has to be moved, right? Because it doesn't make, maybe at a different speed, a different this, but it also has to move. It doesn't make sense. If you have a sphere and then a vacuum and then another sphere, then one sphere can keep going around and the other one could stay right there, right? But if there's nothing between them, then when one moves, the other one has to move. And if that's the case, the Rambam says, why is it that some things, when you look in the sky, don't move, right? So certain stars, we look in the same place, and they're there every night, or at least they barely move. So you have one thing moving, and then the next thing is not moving. And that's the summary of the problem on 324 and the second thing, right? So and then if you go, I'm just going to the end of page 325. You can read through it if you want, but so go ahead.
If we want,
right, but you get the idea. The point being is that Rambam it's very impressive because you see how incredibly well read he was in the science of his day, and he understood acutely, right, what the challenges were that astronomy, physics, mathematics, that all of these fields met up with in his time, right? And these were problems that all of these thinkers that he's quoting, they're all trying to work out their own solution. Nobody gets it until Copernicus and Galileo figure it out, right? At least in terms of the motions of the planets. But so we still got another few hundred years. But you could see how these difficulties build up. And every time somebody tries to suggest a solution, it gets even harder, right? So now I'm at the second paragraph on 325. As for the inclination and deviation that are spoken of regarding the latitude of Venus and Mercury, I have explained to you by word of mouth that I have shown you that it is impossible to conceive their existence in those bodies, right? If you're going to try to say that that Venus and Mercury, they're not a smooth round, but there's a tilt to the way they go around. For the rest, Ptolemy has said explicitly, as you have seen, that one was unable to do this, stating literally, and this is Rambam's quote from the Elimelech. It says on the bottom where it's from. No one should think that these principles and those similar to them may only be put into effect with difficulty, right? If his reason for doing this be that he regards that which we have set forth as he would regard things obtained by artifice and the subtlety of art, and which may only be realized with difficulty. For human matters should not be compared to those that are divine, right? That's what he says. It sounds like a lot of highfalutin words that don't really, in other words, they're not like, we basically saying is, they're not like being forced into place, because I'm showing you things that don't really make sense according to the physics as we understand it, was Ptolemy saying. So you might think that with very much difficulty, somebody slammed the heavens into these rules that really don't fit the rules that we know of, right? But don't think that because human matters aren't compared to divine. When God does something, it's not like hard for him that he's forcing the rules in. This is the rules that he made. This, as you know, is the text of his statement. I have indicated to you the passages from which the true reality of everything I have mentioned to you becomes manifest, except for what I have told you regarding the examination of where the points lie that are the centers of the eccentric circles. For I have never come across anybody who has paid attention to this. I have no idea, right? Right. I haven't yet come across somebody who's written a book explaining how to calculate the middles of these bazillions of different eccentric circles through which all these heavenly bodies are rotating around. For I have never come across anybody. Okay. However, this shall become clear to you through the knowledge of the measure of the diameter of every sphere and what the distance is between the two centers as compared with half the diameter of the Earth. This is basic algebra, trigonometry, and I'm not going to go into it. And he tells you how to read through Al-Kavisi, another astronomer of a century or two before Rambam, in his epistle concerning the distances. If you examine those distances, the truth of the point to which I have drawn your attention will become clear to you. And that was that all of these things are rotating around a million different centers that are all over the place, instead of everything rotating around the center of the Earth, which is what Aristotle's physics would dictate has to be the case. So now that I've laid out to you the incredible confusion which modern astronomy was in, the state that modern astronomy was in at the time of Rambam, and I demonstrated to you that the physics as we understand the world to work, all of those rules that Aristotle put into play that seem to explain pretty well what you and I encounter on a day-to-day basis underneath the moon, simply completely get blasted out of the sky, literally out of the sky, and don't make any sense at all when you apply them to the heavens. Consider now how great these difficulties are. If what Aristotle has stated with regard to natural science is true, there are no epicycles or eccentric circles, and everything revolves around the center of the Earth. But in that case, how can the various motional stars come about? He just summarized everything we just said, right? Is it in any way possible that motion should be, on the one hand, circular, uniform, and perfect, and on the other hand, the things that are observable should be observed in consequence of it, unless it be accounted for by making use of one of the two principles or both of them? This consideration is all, I just turned to page 326, is all the stronger because of the fact that if one accepts everything stated by Ptolemy concerning the epicycle of the moon and its deviation toward a point outside the center of the world and also outside the center of the eccentric circle, it will be found that what is calculated on the hypothesis of the two principles is not at fault by even a minute. The truth of this is attested by the correctness of the calculations, always made on the basis of these principles. Concerning the eclipses, in other words, Ptolemy was able to use his calculations to predict exactly when eclipses would happen and how long it would be dark and the length of time of darkness, etc. Furthermore, how could one, right? So even though it doesn't make sense according to Aristotle, according to Ptolemy's predictions and calculations, it makes perfect sense that these things should exist. So we have this tremendous contradiction. On the other hand, how can one imagine a rolling motion in the heavens or a motion around the center that is not immobile? This is the true perplexity. So here you have it, done. Now, however, okay, I have already explained to you by word of mouth. In other words, I told you, not by giving you a book to read. Remember, I'm still talking to a student. Until now, he was saying, I gave you this book to read, this book to read, this book to read. And I also told you, right, that this does not affect the fact that it makes no sense in terms of physics doesn't bother the astronomer, because the astronomer is, his purpose is not explaining to you the nature of the spheres. He's just explaining to you what happens, right? This star at this time of day is going to be over there and it's going to move to there at that time of night. And that's how it goes around. So I can predict that in 3 weeks on Tuesday, it's going to be over there, right? So there's to posit an astronomical system in which it will be possible for the motions to be circular and uniform and correspond to what is apprehended through sight. They're trying to explain ways things go around which corresponds to the reality that they observe so that they can predict the motions of the heavenly bodies. You know already that in speaking of natural science, the same astronomer that he quoted before expresses a doubt whether Aristotle knew about the eccentricity of the sun and passed over it in silence. Did Aristotle know when he said that everything has to revolve around a specific point in the middle? Did he know that the sun doesn't do that? And he just ignore it? And just because it didn't work for him? Or maybe he didn't know it, right? So he's not sure, this philosopher, or maybe he was not aware. The truth is that I'm telling you, Rambam says, I'm not wondering. I know that Aristotle didn't know of it. And the reason why he didn't know of it, for in his time, mathematics had not been brought to perfection. Rambam knew very well of the tremendous advances that the Arabic scientists and the Muslim scientists had made in mathematics, which allowed for all these calculations, which then contradicted Aristotle. So Aristotle had no idea that the sun wasn't going around and around in a perfect circle. Now you and I know, right, that the orbit of Earth is not a perfect circle around the sun, right? 2 times a year, we're slightly closer to the sun than farther. The calculations that they had made, them thinking the world was in the middle, they noticed that the sun was sometimes slightly closer and sometimes slightly farther through their mathematical calculations, which therefore they decided the sun must not be revolving around a perfect circle around the earth, right? Because they're looking from a different perspective. So I shall repeat here what I've said before. So this is fascinating. So Rambam is here observing, he's telling us what's going on with the history. Aristotle, all that Aristotle states about that which is beneath the sphere of the moon is in accordance with reasoning, right? Aristotle did this because he reasoned through it. He logically deduced A from B, B from C, C from D, etc. These are things that have a known cause that follow one upon the other, concerning which it is clear and manifest at what points wisdom and natural providence are effective, right? However, regarding all that is in the heavens, man grasps nothing. But what's in the heavens, we can't see, we can't measure, we can't feel, we can't touch. I'm sorry, I made a mistake. We can measure. Because nothing but a small measure of what is mathematical. The tiniest grasp that we can get on the heavens is what we get through mathematics. Here we see the Rambam's like piercing mind saying, math is going to be the key to understanding how this all works, right? By using mathematics, that's how we figured out that the heavens don't work according to Aristotle's physics. Now, Rambam didn't know yet that by using mathematics, we are going to disprove all Aristotelian physics. He didn't know that yet, but hold on to that thought for a second. I shall accordingly say in matter of poetical preciousness. So therefore, I'm going to say, when we reach a point where the greatest minds of the world can't figure something out, we know that it's true. We have a little bit of a handle on it, but we just can't figure it out. That's when I say the heavens are the heavens of the Lord, but the earth hath he given to the sons of man. So the heavens, we can't figure them out. That's what the Torah must have meant when it said that the heavens are our God. It doesn't mean God lives there. It doesn't mean there's an old man in heaven who lives there. It means when we look at the heavens, we see things that we don't understand, right? Now, I would like to extrapolate from that to modern day, right? Now we look at the heavens, we have Hubble telescopes and the James Webb telescopes, and we understand so much more. And our mathematics is far and above and more advanced what he had in his day. And we know so much more about physics and astronomy and so on. But still, when the Torah uses the term the heavens, what Rambam is saying here, right? And Rambam, and I'm going to prove this to you in a minute, understands very well that one day we may figure it out a little better, right? Right? He gets that. He's not making a God of the gaps argument here. And if you don't believe me, I'll prove it to you in a minute, right? Because one might think the Rambam is trying to say here, and some accuse him of this, and I'm telling you he's not, right? The Rambam, now we can't figure it out, so I'm going to explain the heavens by saying God runs that. That's a classic God of the gaps understanding, right? That's not what the Rambam is doing. What the Rambam is doing is saying, when you and I look at the heavens, we see things we don't understand, we can't comprehend. So we think to ourselves, wow, like our minds, right, can only go so far, but God goes so much far above that. So you and I, when we see things we don't understand, we can't comprehend, that are beyond us, we should think about the incredible wisdom of God that's beyond the wisdom that we have and that we're capable of. That's what the pasuk means. Just because nowadays we happen to understand a little more about the heavens doesn't mean that the point is any different. We do reach a point beyond human capacity. And that's the fundamental belief that Rambam is trying to teach us, right? That God's wisdom is something that we can't comprehend. When we take note of that point, right, and the Rambam is using his understanding of astronomy in his time as a parable, so that we can understand from that when we look to the heavens, so to speak, we look and think that there is wisdom beyond ours. That's when we appreciate the greatness of God. I mean thereby that the deity alone knows the true reality, the nature, the substance, the form, the motions, and the causes of the heavens, right? That reality that we see, only God alone really, really knows it all, right? We don't. But he has enabled man to have knowledge of what is beneath the heavens. But he gave us a place which we can figure out, right? For that is his world and his dwelling place. This is the truth. For it is impossible for us to exceed to the point starting from which conclusions may be drawn about the heavens. For the latter are too far away from us and are too high in place and in rank. We can't go there. I can't measure it, right? Nowadays, maybe we can with spaceships, telescopes, etc., right? But in Rambam's day, he's saying, we can't go there, so I can't prove it to you. So there are things that are going to always be beyond human grasp. And even the general conclusion that may be drawn from them, namely that they prove the existence of their mover, even the idea, right, that the fact that something has to be moving this whole grand system is a matter the knowledge of which cannot be reached by human intellects, right? We cannot and our intellects really understand that concept of what that means, a mover that makes everything move. And to fatigue the minds with notions that cannot be grasped by them, and to try to waste your time thinking about God, right? He's talking about thinking about God, not thinking about science, which is a mistake that many readers of this passage make. And again, I know you don't necessarily believe me yet, but you will in a minute, right? Right? He's saying to waste your time trying to think about God is a defect in one's inborn disposition or some sort of temptation, right? You're going to try to keep on explaining God, but you can't. We can't do that, right? Rambam is not saying that we can't explain the heavens. Remember, he said that we have a little bit of mathematics. We can get a little bit of a handle on it, which is already a bit of a proof that I'm right in my reading of this Rambam. But then Rambam says, let us then stop at a point that is within our capacity. Now, he does not mean, and some people read this to me, and you'll see why I'm emphasizing this. The Rambam says, when you get to the point where science can't explain anymore, stop thinking about it. No, he's not saying that. He's saying let's stop within our capacity means let's do the things that we can measure. In other words, if you would have told the Rambam, I'm going to give you an instrument by which you can measure the heavens, the Rambam would have said, of course I want to get that instrument and measure the heavens and figure out these explanations. I'm just telling you, don't try to go beyond what humans can't explain. And what is that which humans can't explain? The nature of God himself, right? So to him who was reached by the mighty divine overflow, so that it could be fittingly said of him, with him do I speak mouth to mouth, right? That is the end of what I have to say about this question. And here's where I can prove to you that my reading of the Rambam is right. And he's not making a God of the gaps, fallacious, how do I say fallacious argument? Right. He's not doing that at all. The Rambam here explicitly says, and it boggles my mind that many people, and you'll read this, you'll see that if you look around the Maimonidean literature, understand Rambam to be making a God of the gaps argument, and they use it against him. But he specifically says here as follows: it is possible that someone else may find a demonstration. And a demonstration we've already defined before. Demonstration is what to nowadays we would call an experimental proof, right? Right, a scientific proof, right? By means of which the true reality of what is obscure for me will become clear to him. I just showed you a whole bunch of things about astronomy that made absolutely no sense to me because I am an expert in Aristotelian physics, and Aristotelian physics are completely contradicted by what we visualize when we look up into the stars, right? However, I recognize, right, that someday somebody might come along and prove to me how it works, right? And as you and I all know, we're privileged to live in 2023 where people have come by and explained to Rambam how it all works. The issues with the epicycles, all this stuff is null and void when you start talking about the forces of gravity and inertia and space and time and all that stuff. It's all this stuff is out the window. And the Rambam says to you, and don't think that I'm making a God of the gaps argument and telling you that I'm just telling you, stop thinking. No, somebody's going to think of these things one day. Somebody's going to explain the things that I don't understand. The extreme predilection that I have for investigating the truth. Don't tell me that I want you to stop thinking and stop investigating. I've told you that I have an extreme predilection, of the Rambam's words, of investigating the truth. Always, always, always study and keep trying to figure out the truth. Never stop and say, oh, well, that I can't explain, so God must have done it. That's not what I mean at all, right? It's evidenced by the fact that I have explicitly stated and reported my perplexity regarding these matters. I told you I'm confused, right? Right? If you look carefully at what I wrote, the Rambam said, I didn't say that all of these things prove anything. I told you that I am perplexed. And remember, from the beginning, the introduction to this book, Rambam told us, what do you do when you're perplexed? You study, right? That's what the Rambam means, right? The real answer to the guide for the perplexed. Excuse me, my cat just knocked down the microphone. Is to study, right? So, as by the fact that I have not heard, nor do I know a demonstration as to anything concerning them. In other words, I showed you, I've been learning, I've been studying, I've been reading, I've been discussing with all the scholars, and nobody has yet to show me an explanation. But I'm not telling you not to try. So the Rambam is definitely not against scientific progress. And he explicitly makes this point so that we don't think that he's against scientific progress. And we don't think that he's trying to say, well, I don't know what it is, so that proves that it must be God that did it. That's not at all what he's saying. What he's saying is that we get to, the human mind will always get to a point, right, beyond which we can't understand. That's the point where God is, and that's what a human being shouldn't waste time trying to think about. So that is chapter 24. We're now halfway through book 2, which means we're basically at the halfway point of the entire Moreh Nevuchim. I guess we should open the floor for comments. The next chapter is another very controversial. It has paved the way for tons of anti-Maimonidean rhetoric and all kinds of stuff, and it's grossly misunderstood by a significant percentage of people that have read it over the centuries. And we'll go through it. I'm trying to whet your appetite, but it makes sense to do it next week. But in the meantime, any comments on what we learned today? Now that we know that medieval astronomy was a big fat mess. Go ahead.
Back to what we talked about months ago. Sorry.
Yeah.
Go
ahead.
I spoke to somebody who was an astrophysicist a long time ago, and he said that only when there was movement did time start, according to the scientists. So all these spheres, basically, it's since now we have established that the world was created by God, then of course he's the one who moves them and arranges them, and like, I don't know why we would have to fight with Maimonides when he's just simplifying the issue for us.
Yeah, well, I mean, that idea that movement was the beginning of time, Rambam made that point several times, right? That time is dependent upon movement. Yeah, I mean, the fact that the Rambam is presenting this argument against the eternity of the universe and saying that the world had a beginning in time is something that we have proven scientifically to be true now. So yeah, the debate would be a very different one, right? But the debate right now, today, but this is me talking. I can't say what the Rambam would have said because he's not here to tell us. But the debate today would not be so much about whether or not there was a beginning point in time, because that's been scientifically established, right? There was a Big Bang. But the question is, are the rules of the universe as they are they that way because they have to be, right? Or are they that way because God decided they should be that way, right? And there's a big difference there, because if they're that way because they have to be, then you just then God couldn't have made it any different, right? Right, which would contradict, and it's going to be relevant in the next chapter. That would contradict our ability to say that God can make miracles happen, or God can intervene, or if things are the way they are because they have to be. It would also negate the whole concept of free will, right? Because if everything is the way it is because it has to be, then how do we choose to do A, B, or C? I mean, on some complex level, we're just doing the things we're doing because we have to, right? And then it takes away from the whole idea of the purpose, right? Rambam emphasized so much that God created the world with a purpose, right? So the people that today would say that there's an ultimate law of physics which establishes that everything is the way it is because it has to be this way. Those people would be the ones that Rambam would be arguing with today, right? And he would say, no, I agree with you that those are the rules with which the universe runs, and the universe does have to run that way because those are the rules. But why are those the rules? because God made them that way, right? There was and once you say that, then there's a purpose for it, and then you can still have the same arguments, right? Even with believing that, even now that we've proven that the world has a time that it was created or came to be, depending on which side of the debate you're trying to be on. Does that make sense?
Thank you for explaining.
Yeah.
I wanted to just add, it's wonderful he has these last few sentences that you just concluded with. It's possible that someone else may find a demonstration by means of which some humility, but yet when you go back on what you just covered, for example, at the top of 327, when he says a sentence is, but he enabled man to have knowledge of what's beneath the heavens. So that's his world. This is the truth. And then the sentence, for it is impossible for us to exceed to the point starting from which conclusions may be drawn about the heavens. So he has these declarative sentences that seem to close the door. And
yeah, you're making a really good point. I'm trying to interrupt.
The point I wanted to make here is that some of these declarative sentences, and it's always difficult when you're doing something complex to have a qualifier, but it leads me to believe that he maybe wrote these himself in the privacy of his home, his office, at the middle of the night, and he needed an editor. And I've never heard of anyone.
Well, first of all, Rambam himself said in the beginning that he's going to write things that are contradictory, right? And
okay.
Right. But besides that, what I think the real answer to this specific question is, and many writers have said this. I've read this in a lot of Maimonidean scholars. I think that Rambam actually thought that they had reached the end of what science was gonna explain, right? Like, had you asked the Rambam, do you realistically think that someone's gonna come by and explain the heavens in a completely different way and knock out Aristotelian physics altogether? I think the Rambam would have said, no, I think Aristotle makes sense, right? He explains everything in this world, and the things that are in the heavens don't make sense. And those things, they are just the way they are because God made them that way, not because of the rules. I think that's what Rambam actually thought. However, he recognizes that it's possible, maybe I'm all wrong, maybe someone's going to figure it out, but I don't think so. It's kind of like, when Newton came by and explained physics, right? And obviously completely smashed all of Aristotelian physics, right? I think in Newton's day, most people studying Newton would have said, we got it all figured out now, right? By then, we already knew that the sun was the center of the solar system, not the earth, right? And I think that in the next couple hundred years, if you would have come by and told somebody that Newtonian physics only makes sense on the observable, measurable things that we can see, but not on the molecular level, it's completely different. And then there's going to be a whole new thing called quantum mechanics, right? I think that people would have thought you were out of your mind. Most scientists would have thought, no, Newton got it all, right? And then Einstein comes along, right? And then so I think that Rambam in his time actually thought that what he wrote in the beginning was the truth. He really thought that above the heavens, we're never going to figure this out, right? Which is why he wrote those declarative statements, right? But the very fact that he had, so what we're doing is we're flipping Rambam. Some people want to paint him into being, a medieval backward guy, right? We're painting him into just the opposite, right? He's the guy that, despite thinking that all of science was basically done, realized in the back of his mind that it's possible that it's not. And he says it explicitly in the context of which is the most powerful statement, right? The extreme predilection that I have for investigating the truth, right? If anything doesn't sum up the Rambam, I mean, that's got to be it. I mean, I don't care, even though I think that we got it all, but I have an extreme predilection to investigate the truth. So I will keep going. If somebody has another point, I'll read that book. The guy comes out with another, I'll read that one until we get it. And that's really the greatness. And like you pointed out, and is the Rambam's humility. Like, it takes a tremendous amount of humility to think that it's possible that you got it all wrong.
Right.
How many people, how many of us ever think that way? We all think we got it all figured out, right? All the things, we think about the world, that we know that we got this. Maybe we don't know diddly squat. Maybe tomorrow we're going to wake up and we're completely wrong.
Until Louis Pasteur, they thought that the smallest unit was the cell.
Right, exactly. And you never know. We'll all wake up tomorrow morning and what we thought was white is black. What we thought was black is white. I don't know.
Okay, good. Thank you.
All right. Any other questions, comments? If not, then tomorrow we begin. We got to the top of the hill to halfway. The rest is we're going down the hill. So at 25, like I said, is some shockingly controversial statements on the part of the Rambam. But we're gonna tease through. We're gonna work our way through them and show how beautiful they are. But
do you expect in 2024 to go beyond volume 2? So I should order volume 3 at this point?
Well, no, 2 and 3 are in if you're using this one, then they're in the same volume. So that's all
okay. Save the money. Okay, that's good.
Yeah. Because the first volume is a large intro, which is actually one of the best books on the guide for the Perplexed, is just the intro in the Pines edition. But if you ever have a chance to read it, but we have some really, really good, cool stuff to come. So I'll see you all next week, Mirz Hashem, and have a wonderful evening. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.
You're welcome.